Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
What is actually happening in the dental industry? What are the most prominent trends? And how might these affect you and your practice over the next 5, 10 years? And most importantly, what can you do now to take advantage of these trends and create the most success for yourself, your family, your team, your patients, and the industry as a whole? Well, that's what I want to talk about in this week's episode. And as a heads up, regardless of what point you are in your career, you could be a fourth-year dental student or you can have been practicing for 35 years. Does not matter. This information does have some bearing to you. So I do hope it helps, but I do advise that you listen to it because it gives you an idea of what's actually going on. Now, if you've been an MGE client, or you're an MGE client rather, or a longtime listener, you'll know that every year we do our owners conference. It's a sort of a combined convention and alumni event. It's our largest event every year. I usually start the conference. It's a 4-day event. I start off with a presentation on the state of the industry with all the facts, the figures, the numbers, etc. Then usually a week or two after the conference, I'll do a podcast on the subject, at least covering the major bullet points. So the owners conference is over. So here we are. Now, what's different about this year's podcast is in prior year podcast, I would break down all the numbers, and I thought it was a little bit number intensive. I do plan to do a video on this that we'll put on our YouTube channel where I'll have all the numbers. I just think that if I'm going to get into these numbers really in depth, it's tough to do it, especially if you're listening in the car and you're hearing 203,333. It just gets to be a bit, you lose the thread, right? But I do want to talk about the key points because I do think that this is something that you need to really be aware of. The other thing is in prior years, I was sort of tracking what was going on. I'd be comparing this year's numbers to last year's numbers. Well, now that I'm somewhat conversant with where these are and I keep track of them on a regular basis, I was able to do some modeling of my own and really do a deep dive on some of this stuff to see what was really happening in the industry. And what I found, and we've been kind of talking about this, but this further confirmed what we've been talking about. We're in the process. You're in the middle of a generational shift in the dental industry, possibly a shift that only occurs every few generations. Now, it's hard to feel this generational shift because you're right in the middle of it. And we're living day to day. We're not looking back 20 years later, right? But it's happening. Now, this generational shift opens the door to incredible opportunity if you play it right, or it can be hard times if you don't. So that's why, I'm advising if you have a chance, please listen to this and see how you can incorporate it into what it is that you're doing. So with that, enough of lead up. Let's just jump right into it. What am I going to cover in this episode? I'm going to just very generally, without getting into too much of the numbers, I'm going to get into the current supply of dentists in the United States, ownership trends, how many doctors are owning practices. I'm going to get into DSOs a little bit and what's happening with some of those. I'm going to talk about the general labor market in dentistry, and then I'm going to talk about insurances, and then sort of give you a little bit of a summary with the big picture with some suggested action steps. So with that said, I'm just going to roll right into this. Again, like I told you, I'm not going to get into every little thing. I do have slides for all of this, and I'm putting these as it's a free download on the episode webpage. You just, you click it, you can download it. And the slides have all the exact numbers. So when I tell you look, you can see that the ownership trends are changing, there's a slide for it. And if you really want to get the basis, and it also has this citation for the slide. This information came from this source. All right. Okay. So let's start with supply of dentists. How many doctors are there in the United States right now? Well, there's been over 200,000 for at least the last 5 or 6 years. And when I say doctors, I mean dentists, right? How many practicing dentists in the U.S.? Now, what's interesting is if you look in 2023, from 2022, this is one of the early slides, you'll notice that the number of practicing dentists in the U.S., and 2023 is the latest numbers that we have, and this is from the ADA, actually went down. Prior to that, it had been going up every year, incrementally, by 0.25%, right? But from 2022 to 23, we actually have 232 less dentists practicing in the U.S. It went from, I'll give the exact number, only time here, 202,536 to 202,304. which is kind of interesting considering we have more dental schools, which I'll talk about here in a second. But the number of doctors have gone down. Now, why is this happening? Well, some people are aware of this and some people are not. There's sort of a larger, bigger picture demographic shift that's been happening in the United States over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Actually longer if you consider how long it was in the making. So we've all heard the term, a baby boomer or a boomer. It's used derogatorily by people like my kids or, my nephew, right? And I'm not using it that way. So we have different generations. We had the baby boom generation, which was the generation that was born right after World War II. Like my parents are from the baby boom generation, born in the mid to late 40s. Usually I think the baby boom generation ran till it depends on who's defining it. Sometimes people have it running till 1960 or 62. Some people have it running to the late 50s if you were born in that period. Well, the baby boom generation was humongous. You had all these people coming back from the war, the GIs coming back from the war, and they started families and you had a zillion kids, all right? So a lot of kids in that generation, the baby boom generation. The generation that followed that was Generation X, which I'm a part of. These were people born in the late 60s and the 70s, all right? And these people grew up in the 80s. Then you had the millennials, which were born in the mid to late 80s and 90s. And then you have Generation Z. I think we're in Generation Alpha now or Double A. I don't know what it is, right? Anyway, but for the younger people, and there's different names. But the point being is the baby boom generation was huge. It was much bigger than Generation X. My generation was tiny in comparison to the baby boom generation. And the baby boom generation was bigger than the millennial generation. So if you think this thing through for a second, if you had tons of people born in the 40s and 50s, how old would those folks be now? They would be in their 70s and 80s, okay, or maybe late 60s. Well, normally when people are at that age, they retire. And again, this isn't an ageism thing here, folks. I'm over 50. The point being is that if I'm over 50, I'm not planning on working another 35 years. If someone is 25, like my nephew, he is planning on working another 35 years. Do you see? That's how that works. So how old somebody is in relation to how many, the age breakdown within a profession does matter. Now in dentistry, you have an added problem, which was you had a ton of doctors produced in the 80s, tons in the 80s, and very few in the 90s because dental schools started closing in the 90s. Now, there are more schools opening again now, but I remember this in the 90s, hearing about schools that had been around for a while just shutting down their dental programs. That's reversing, but it's sort of like this thing where we created a lot of doctors, then we stopped creating doctors, and then went, oh my gosh, we're going to run out of dentists, so now we're starting to create some, but there's going to be this period, a lull, where we're going to have a drop in the supply of dentists because there weren't enough created soon enough, if that makes sense. Now, to speak to this point exactly, there's two things I'll break down for you. The normal demographics you get from the American Dental Association, and their information from the American Dental Association Health Policy Institute is awesome. They have a ton of data. If I didn't have that data, I would not be able to do any further modeling that I did. But the basic info you get from the ADA is they'll give you an age breakdown of dentists in the U.S., and their brackets that they use, and you'll see this in the slides, are under 35, and then they do 10-year increments, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and 65 and over. Now, that's great, right? And to give you an idea of where we stand just with those demographics, the official ADA numbers. Right now, close to 1/3 of the profession of the 202,000 doctors we had practicing as of 2023. So close to 1/3 are 55 and over. Close to 1/3. Okay. Now, what this doesn't tell you though is, and one number I'm going to throw out at you is the average dentist's retirement age. And this is average. I know folks who are 75 and still practicing. The average retirement age is 69. Average. Okay. So if you take that age bracket, for example, this is where this becomes problematic. 55 to 64. Okay. 55 to 64. Well, if the average retirement age is 69, and you're looking at that bracket of 55 to 64. Well, some of those folks are technically 5 years away from average retirement age. The other folks are almost 15 years, 14 years to be, exact, away from retirement age. That doesn't give you a really good gauge. I was about to say gauge, which isn't a word. Anyway, so what I decided to do, and this is where I was able to do further modeling, was I took these ADA numbers and I thought, well, how can I break these down into more exact groups? And now keep in mind, these are estimates, folks, but these estimates are based off pretty solid modeling. Okay. And the modeling I based it off of was just base U.S. demographics. How does the U.S. population break down? As well as when I got into people over 65, I looked at average retirement ages and the retirement trends of similar professions, lawyers, medical doctors, etc. So I could get an idea of, when we say we have X amount of dentists 65 and over, well, how many of those are 75? How many are 70? How many are 69? You see, I wanted to get a general idea of this, right? Because then that's going to play into how many dentists will be practicing in the next 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. Because if somebody is 70 years old or 75 years old, there's a pretty good chance that they will have retired in the next 5 years versus somebody who's 65. Do you see? So what I did is I broke that down further, and you'll see a slide here which says U.S. dentists 2024. Okay, and this breaks it down under 30 to 75 plus. All right, because as I mentioned, we have a third of the profession is over 55. Well, over 15% of the profession is over 65. Okay. And that comes to almost 32,000 doctors are over the age of 65 in the US, right? Now, what's interesting, when I broke it down that more exactly, I was able to isolate an estimated number of doctors who are actually 60 years of age and over in the US, right? That number came to over 50,000, or over a quarter of the profession. So if someone's 60 years and over, and again, look, they want to practice for another 15, 20 years, more power to them. But again, I would probably say, I know I'm saying but again a lot, and I will in this episode, I can't imagine someone who's 60, 65 years old. Sure, they may keep their license and still practice. Many of those may be practicing because they want to, no longer out of economic necessity. They may have definitely reduced their schedule. They're not working a 32-hour clinical week plus 8 hours, 10 hours of paperwork. They're working maybe 1 or 2 days a week, 3 days a week. So it's not the same as some doctor who graduated 5 years ago and is cranking a 40-hour week. It's a little bit different, right? So 25% of the profession is over 60. Okay, so keep that number in mind for a second. Now, with that number in mind, let's have a look at how many new doctors can we expect over the next 10 years. Well, the one good thing is we are opening more dental schools. We needed it. We are opening it. And to that end, from 2019 to 2024, an additional 7 schools or 7 programs opened. Okay. We went from 66 schools in 19 to 73 in 2024. And there are plans in the next year or two to open another 2 schools, which is great. We need more dentists. So what does that translate into? Well, taking a look at the current programs we have, I wanted to estimate a conservative number of graduates over the next 10 years. I didn't want it to be every seat was full, but a conservative number of graduates over the next 10 years. Based on program capacity, a conservative estimate on the number of dentists over the next 10 years is about 78,000. Almost 80. So about 7,800 average per year. Now, it's not going to be 7,800 year over year. It'll be ramping up over time as more of these programs fill out, right? But to give you an idea, we used to produce about, as of 5-6 years ago, 6,000 doctors a year. That was the average in the U.S. Well, we're ramping up to where we're going to be producing 7,800 or almost 8,000 a year. This is good. We can expect about 78,000 new grads between 2024 and 2033. So that's very, very good. But is that going to be fast enough, these new doctors coming in, to replace the doctors who will be retiring and leaving the profession? Short answer is no, not in the short term. Absolutely not, especially not in the next 5 years. As a matter of fact, what I'm predicting, and I'll give you my justification for this prediction, I'm predicting that by 2028, we'll have about 14,000 less dentists practicing than we have today. And by 2033, we'll have about 3,000 or 4,000 less dentists practicing than we have today. We will not hit 2023's numbers until after 2033 at the current rate of projected graduates and current rate of projected retirements. So how am I projecting this? Well, here's my rationale in math. And again, like I said, as I'm explaining, this is all in the slideshow. Okay. And again, I'm not going to kill everybody with, 1.32%, whatever, right? But all right. So the first thing we have to look at, we have that average retirement age I gave you of 69. There's something called an projected outflow or exit rate over a 5-year period. What does that mean? It means that based on someone's age, what percent of the group of the people in that age bracket will leave the profession over a 5-year period. That's all it means. So up to the age of 54, between 3 and 4% of doctors will retire or leave the profession in a 5-year period. So if you had 100 doctors, 3 or 4, 5 years later, would not be practicing dentistry. Easy enough, right? Now, 55 to 64, about 20% of doctors will leave the profession in a 5-year period. So if I have, 100 doctors between the ages of 55 and 64, and I came back 5 years later, 20 of them would no longer be practicing dentistry. We'd have 80 left. 65 and over, and this, I expanded on this, by the way. The average outflow rate over 5 years is 54.5%. Okay, almost 55%. So if you have 100 docs, 65 and over, 45 will still be practicing dentistry 5 years later. So what I did was, because I had expanded on using the demographic modeling I had, how many doctors were, 70, 75, 80, et cetera, right? And like I said, these are estimates, folks. There's no exact, it's tough when you're doing this because you're dealing with literally hundreds of thousands of people, right? I took a look at modeling this exit rate a little further because, okay, if 65 to 69 is 54.5, it was 65 and over. What would be the average retirement rate for someone who was 70 and over? Like in 5 years, over 5 years. How many of those folks are going to leave the profession? Based on the modeling I did, I estimated 75%. So if someone is 71 years old today, by the time they're 76, there's a 75% chance they're no longer practicing. Okay. 75 and over, I modeled like 95%, 80 and over, 99%. So if someone's 80 years old today, there's a 99% chance they're probably not practicing 5 years from now. Okay. And this is all on the slideshow. So based on the current exit rates, the current dental population, the projected supply of new graduates, we're predicting less doctors. And that's where I have these tables here. You'll see there's U.S. Dentist 2024 broken down by age, and that gives you that number of 202,304. Then all I did was I then took a look at the projected graduates and advanced this table 5 years, dumped the projected graduates into the under 30 bracket. I mean, sure, some will be over 30, but whatever. Put them in the under 30 bracket, and I was very generous here. I even took the graduates for 2028 and put them into the 2028 dental numbers, even though these folks won't have a license till later in the year. Put them into the under 30 bracket and advanced everybody 5 years and moved out people at the average exit rate. Based on that projection, by 2028, we're looking at under 189,000 doctors. So we'll go from 202 to 189. Then by 2033, the number starts to revert based on the number of graduates, and we're up to 197. But we're still not at the 202. We're still 5,000 short of where we are today. So what we're projecting is 5 years, we're going to have a severe drop as the baby boom generation starts to retire out of the industry, which right now is 65 and over is it's over 15% of the industry. And we don't have enough new young replacements to fill those ranks yet in order to get the profession back up to the numbers that they are today. That's the base projection. Now, let's take a look at practice ownership. So I've said this on the podcast before, and I've cited these numbers. Practice ownership among dentists has been just declining over the years, period. And this is from the ADA. In 2005, almost 85% of dentists owned a practice. In 2021, that number was 73%. In 2023, it was 72.5%. That's a declining figure. If you were to extrapolate those figures into the future, by 2028 and 2033, for example, we're going to be at 69% and 65.7%. These are predictions, folks. These are not exacts, right? Then I have a little table from the ADA that shows this. Now, here's the problem. The biggest decline in ownership is coming from younger doctors. And you'll see, I have a table here that says there's something from the ADA that says practice ownership dropping amongst younger dentists. And it shows you that, for instance, back in 2005, I mentioned this on the podcast before, dentists under 30, over a quarter of dentists under 30 own their own practice in 2005. That number is now 8.8%. Okay. Dentists, I think it was 30 to 34 back in 2005, 55% owned a practice. That number today is 32%. So it's the younger groups that are dropping off the most. Whereas you take the 55 to 64 age bracket, that number has hardly dropped. It's gone from 93 to 89%. The 45 to 54 bracket has dropped by like 3 to 5%. So the older doctors, for the most part, still own their practice, whereas it's younger doctors who are not buying practices. So what we have is we have a bit of a broken transition model. The model used to be, if you graduated in 1985 or 95 or whatever, you might associate for a bit. You also weren't stuck with crippling student debt. You were stuck with moderate student debt if you needed debt to go to dental school. But then you'd go associate. You might go associate because there weren't a lot of DSOs or corporate offices. There were corporate practices, but there wasn't a DSO movement like there is today. You'd go associate for some other doc, and then you'd either buy that practice, buy in, or go buy your own office. That was the average way it worked. Nowadays, it does not work that way. A third of kids right now go to work for a DSO. That's the usual intention when they come out of dental school. And I understand because they're getting guaranteed crazy base pay and help with their loans and things like this. But so ownership has dropped dramatically. So I want you to think with this for a second. You can see sort of where I'm going. We have the group that is most likely to own a practice closest to retirement. Okay? Do that in your head for a second. We have over 50,000 doctors over the age of 60. We have a third of the profession over 55. Those are the doctors most likely to own a practice. And the younger doctors are not buying practices like they used to. We're about to produce a ton of new younger doctors, and then the older doctors will want to transition out. What's going to happen to all these practices? Well, let's first talk about how many practices are there actually in the United States, because this is a very deceptive number. Depending on how you get it, if you go pull a mailing list, for instance, it might be the number of dental businesses in the United States. Well, you could have a dental office with 3 different doctors there who all have separate PLLCs. That shows up as 3 dental businesses, but how many actual physical locations are there? 1. Okay. So that isn't a good tell. There was some basic data that came from the ADA and a government agency, and it's an estimate on how many actual individual dental practice locations there are in the U.S. There are a little over 135,000 physical dental offices in the United States of America. Now, how many of these are owned by dentists? Well, of these 135 practices, and this was another tough one to figure out, so we have an estimate here, roughly, and this is a wide variant, 13 to 19,000 of these practices are owned by DSOs. So we have 135,000 offices, 13 to 19,000 are owned by DSOs. This leaves an average or an estimated number of 116 to 122,000 offices that are privately owned. And this was a really tough one to figure out because the way the ADA classifies an owner, and again, I'm not complaining about the ADA, their data has been invaluable, but the way they classify an owner doesn't differentiate between a solo practitioner and a partner. So, let's say you're a doc, I'm a doc, we're partners, we're both owners, but we only own one physical location. Or you own your own practice and nobody else owns it with you, you're an owner. The other thing it doesn't differentiate is it does not their categorizations aren't helpful for this because for instance, let's say you're a doctor, you own your own practice and you have an associate. Well, from an ADA classification perspective, you're considered a group practice. But let's say me and 2 other oral surgeons own a practice. We're a group practice. But that's a wildly different situation. We're all partners. You're a solo owner with an associate. But we're still a group practice. So what this tells you is based on our ownership numbers, and I'll go over those in a second, based on the number of doctors by age that own a practice, there are obviously a lot of partnerships in the U.S., okay? Because there's allegedly 145,000 dentists who own a practice in the U.S., but there's only 116 to 120,000 locations. So there are some partnerships, right? So there are multiple owners, in other words. So what I did, and you'll see these in these charts, ownership by age group. It's about like 20, 30 slides into the presentation, okay? We have a looming ownership problem right now. So out of these 120,000 practices, okay, that are in the United States right now, roughly 43% of them are owned by doctors 55 and over. Let that sink in your head for a second. Almost like, not almost half, but close to half. 43% are owned by doctors 55 and over. 50,523 of the 120,000 offices. Okay? 41%, almost 42%. Okay? Now, how does that look over the next 5 years? Well, there's two things to consider. Younger doctors aren't buying, and we're about to graduate a bunch of them. And the trend has been dropping. So, for instance, in 2005, a doctor under 30, 1/4 of them owned an office. By 2021, it was like 9%. By 2023, it was 8.8%. So if those numbers continue to drop, then realistically, we're going to end up with, by 2028, we'll have maybe 7% of doctors under 30 owning a practice. And by 2033, we might have 5.5% of doctors owning a practice under 30. Do you see, like, if that ownership trend continues in the way we're going? Well, so I have on these, if you look, I have several slides and they're different tables. I have something called best case, and then I have worst case, not worst case. Like, worst case is a meteor hits the planet, right? That's worst case. Best case and worst case. Best case is if the current ownership trends hold, meaning right now, doctors under 30, 8.8% own a practice. If that continues, that's best case. But that's been declining over the years. Worst case is if it continues to decline at the rate it's currently declining, which is most likely. So I have a model here for 2028, and I have a model here for 2033. Now, why is this important? Because what it shows you is that based on the aging demographic within the industry and the new doctors coming in, many of whom won't buy a practice, as of 2023, we have 120,000 privately owned locations. Based on this projection, as of 2028, best case, we'll only have 100,000. Worst case, we'll have 97,000. Do you get that? So in other words, 20,000 practices are going to vanish over the next 5 years. Vanish. By 2033, I'm estimating that best case, 23,000 practices vanish. Worst case, over 30,000 practices vanish by 2033. Because you'll have older doctors who own the practices retiring and younger doctors coming in who won't buy, until later in their career. So what are our basic data points here? One, supply of dentists is projected to drop over the next 10 years. Close to in the practice ownership, we have an issue there. Close to 70% of all private dental practices are owned by dentists 45 and over. Over 36,000 of these offices are owned by doctors 60 and over, and all of whom would reach average retirement age by 2033. Younger doctors are not buying practices. So we're going to have what I'm calling orphan practices. With the current conservatively decreasing ownership rates, the current model shows that within 5 years, 20 to 23,000 practices will essentially disappear. And within 10 years, this number could reach 23 to 31,000. Okay? Now, so there's two things to look at here. You might go, well, but DSOs are going to buy them. No, they're not. DSOs have a specific target. They're usually looking for a practice that's doing at least $1.5 million a year. So I'm estimating 20 to 30,000 practices over the next 5-10 years disappear. Most of those are not doing $1.5 million a year. So it's going to be the doctor either selling if they can, or just closing the doors or selling the charts. That's what we're looking at, because the younger doctors aren't buying. Okay. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, this is an incredible opportunity. If you're a private doc and you want to actually open more offices and, high quality private dental offices, now is the time. And there's also just a general opportunity here, which is the supply to demand factor. The U.S. population is continuously growing. Well, there's going to be less dentists and more people. So there's that, right? At least for a period. I would definitely play it a little harder than that personally, because we'll get into DSOs in a second. I'm not a huge fan of the DSO model, especially when it's not driven by a dentist, not just clinically, but just in general, because I don't think dentistry, I think you should be able to make a lot of money in dentistry. That isn't the point, but I don't think it should be all about the bottom line. It should be about what's best for the patient. So, and what's best for the patient isn't always the cheapest. And you're not going to get that viewpoint without somebody who has that viewpoint. Usually it's going to be a doctor or someone who really loves the industry. So I'm not a fan of the whole monetization or corporatization of dentistry in that sense. If it's doctor driven, I'm a fan of it. I think it's a good thing. Okay. Now, what could affect this if we have lower than expected dental school graduates? If we have a sudden increase in the number of schools, that could make things better. If DSOs just decide to start buying smaller practices, which they just can't, they can't justify it on their balance sheet, but whatever. Or if we end up with a lot of the doctors who are 60 years of age and older who decide to continue working, then that's a possibility as well, right? All right, so let's talk DSOs for a second. So here I want to get into just some basic facts so you know exactly what you're dealing with. And then a couple of the problems that are starting to show up in these, because this was the big, great investment for private equity 5-10 years ago. That's starting to change. So let's first start looking at with some basic numbers. Right now, 13.8% of dentists in the U.S. as of 2023 were affiliated with a DSO. 13.8. That's up from a little over 10% in 2019. In 2023, almost about 28% of dentists who were less than 5 years out of school and about 20% of dentists who were 6 to 10 years out of school were affiliated with the DSO. So the largest bracket of doctors who are affiliated with the DSO tend to be younger. All right. Then according to a survey by the ADEA, the American Dental Education Association, I think that's what that is. There was a survey of dental school seniors, 34%. As of 2023, plan to join a DSO after graduation, which is up from 12% in 2015. Okay? Now, there are roughly 200 to 250 true DSOs in the United States with 5 or more locations. This is, again, another just annoying thing to look for. You read how many DSOs in the U.S., and you'll see 4,300. It was ridiculous. Here's the deal. If I own more than one location, I might be called a DSO. I'm not set up like a DSO. I'm just a dentist and I own 2 offices, but I'm called a DSO by some people and other people won't. So let's go by actual impact. So we start with this, 200 to 250 own 5 or more locations. Fewer than 60 DSOs have over 50, and only about 20 to 25 DSOs have over 100. Okay, and the top 50 DSOs in the United States own over 10,000 practices. So if we're estimating 13 to 19,000 offices or DSOs, the top 50 own most of those. And you know the names of these folks, right? So now, as of 2024, 9 out of the top 10 DSOs in the U.S. were owned or backed by private equity. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole thing on private equity, but you're probably familiar with it. You know, things, funds, like investment funds, okay? Additionally, private equity firms own 27 of the top 30 DSOs. So the top 30 DSOs in the U.S., private equity owns 27 of them. And they also own 84% of the individual locations connected to these DSOs. And this is just based on our observation with our client base. The primary acquisition target is collecting at least $1.5 million a year. So now, what are the problems these DSOs are having? And I don't want to get into a whole slam DSOs thing. I hate DSOs, blah, blah. That isn't the point. But I've had some issues with them for quite some time. But one of the bigger problems you're seeing now, so what has happened over the last 4 or 5 years? Interest rates have gone up. These private equity groups, their basic model is I'm going to buy a company, keep it for about 5 years, and then offload it to somebody else. So sell it to another hedge fund or a private equity group or to a pension fund. I'm going to get rid of it, right? Well, private equity is having to hold on to these things longer now because they're not as profitable as maybe they were projected to be. Whatever. The other thing that people look for is something called recapitalization, which I'm going to explain here in a little bit. You may be familiar with the term, you may not, but I'll make it real simple. But one of the big problems DSOs are having right now, at least in my estimation, is debt and rising interest rates. So most of the biggest DSOs, and I'm going to give you 3 examples, but some of the biggest DSOs are carrying huge amounts of debt. Some of it's in the billions. And a lot of that debt is high risk, meaning first lien loans, which means, that if they don't make the payments, they lose the property, right? The whoever they have the debt to has first dibs on their assets. So with interest rates higher, it's harder for these DSOs or harder for any organization at this point to refinance or grow without hitting a higher interest rate or potential financial trouble. So to give you an idea, I picked 3, and this is all publicly available business information. As a matter of fact, I'll start with Heartland, and I don't have a button on these groups or whatever. I got this from Standard & Poor's, S&P's Global. Okay, this is where I got this data. So Heartland right now, as of 2023, has a $280 million revolving credit facility, which is due in 2027, and a $2 billion first lien term loan. And then their credit rating. Now, I was debating how to explain this. Generally, you're given a business credit rating when you're a bigger business. And S&P, Standard & Poor's, you've probably heard that term before. They have a global rating system, okay? Or global rating's the name of the organization. They assigned Heartland a credit rating of B minus, okay? Now, what does B minus mean? Well, most of you listening to this will have some type of investments, right? Where you might have a fund that you're invested in or bonds. What's a bond is debt, right? So the U.S. government sells bonds, and based on how it's rated determines how much interest that bond has to pay. So if it's a very highly rated bond, the top rating is AAA, AAA, they can pay low interest because they're considered low risk. If it's AA, A minus, and then it goes to triple B, right? Then the interest that these bonds have to pay starts going up and up because they become higher risk. And look, I'm not trying to give an investment primer here, and this isn't investment advice. You can look this up on your own too, but this is generally how this works. Heartland was given a rating of B minus. Okay? Now, technically, and I'm not saying this as a slight on Heartland, if I'm a fund manager, let's say I'm managing an investment fund, and I'm going to put some of the money from this fund into bonds. I could not buy bonds that were rated B or B minus. Those would not be considered investment grade bonds. They would be too low rated, even though they're paying high interest rates because they're rated that way, which indicates a degree of risk. I'm not dissing Heartland. That isn't the point. I'm just saying this is what Standard & Poor's says. Okay. They are owned. The majority of it is owned by the global investment firm KKR, Heartland. Then you have MB2 Dental. They have a pre-approved loan currently in place to they secured a $2.3 billion debt facility from KKR as well. They're majority owned by another capital partner group. Then we have Pacific Dental Services. Pacific Dental planned to issue an incremental $250 million first lien term loan, which is increasing its adjusted leverage to 5.3x now in 2025. Now that sounds like ridiculous when you listen to it. What does that mean? Leverage at 5.3x. So let's say you collect $1 million a year. If you owe $1 million or $2 million, you're at 2x leverage. You have $2 million in debt and you produce or collect rather $1 million. PDS is currently the plan at this point. This is based on information from there's a LinkedIn article on this, which I have cited at the bottom of the slide. They're projecting to adjust its leverage. Their leverage will be at 5.3x, meaning that their debt is 5.3 times their yearly revenue. Now, again, I'm not making a commentary on this, but generally banks don't like to see, this is at least my experience, more than 4. Okay, which even sounds to us in the small business world pretty crazy, right? Like I collect $1 million and I'm $4 million in debt. I'm not just saying $4 million in debt, including your house. I'm talking about your business. All right, that still seems high, but whatever. They're going to be at 5.3, and their credit rating, according to S&P Global Ratings, is a B, which is again not investment grade debt. So why is this a problem if you're rated a B or a B minus? And again, look, I'm not privy to their financials or how this works. I'm just going off of publicly available information. And there's not a ton of it because these are all owned by private equity who don't have reporting requirements like a publicly traded company does do, whatever. But the point being is when you have a B or a B minus credit rating and you are taking on debt, you're generally going to be having to pay a higher interest rate, which increases your financial pressure. You see, this is like an individual credit score. So if I have an 850, I'm going to get a better interest rate on my mortgage than if I have a 650. This is common knowledge. The same thing applies based on your credit rating from S&P. If I have a lower credit rating, I'm going to pay more interest or potentially could than if I have a higher credit rating. If I'm at AAA, I'm going to pay less interest. You see? So that's one of the problems they have. So when they go to refinance debt, if anything, it could tell you it would at least sort of hamper their expansion potentially because getting money is going to be harder, especially new money in this current interest rate environment. The other thing is associate turnover. Among new dentists in DSO affiliated practices, 48% intended to leave their current practice setting compared to only 8% of dentists surveyed in non-DSO practices. This is according to a survey from the ADA Health Policy Institute. Okay, so associate turnover is a potential problem there. And to that end, I included this in my presentation. I just went to the Heartland site and I pasted something from their website, and you can see it. They're offering like these ungodly salaries and no experience required for a doctor, which I just think, look, this is opinion now. And I'm not riding a kid who's just out of school and just got their license, but yeah, I think it's just not a great formula for success. That's all. The other issue they're running into right now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is they're running into private equity pullback. Private equity is not as aggressive, at least from what we've seen. And I've seen it anecdotally. I've seen it with clients who've had deals fall through and things like this with DSOs, because private equity isn't spending as freely as it was, let's say, in 21 or 22. And, I have a supporting quote here from the CEO of Freedom Dental Partners, which is a DSO, where it says that obtaining private equity recapitalization has become an increasingly challenging feat for many DSOs. We've also seen lower valuations. It used to be, you've heard of these multiples, 7X, 12X. Now we're seeing 5X, right? So what is recapitalization? Because this is where it gets kind of interesting. You've probably heard this term. I'm just going to clear it up for everybody. If you don't know, if you do know it, fast forward past this point. So recapitalization, and I have a slide for this, is when private equity firm either puts more money into a company or sells it to another investor to keep growing or cash out. It's like hitting the financial refresh button for a DSO. And these deals are crucial because they help pay off old debt, fund new acquisitions, and reward investors. But now with higher interest rates and tighter lending, some DSOs can't find buyers or new money. So without recapitalization, they're stuck with expensive debt, and fewer options, which potentially means stalled growth, staff cuts. I mean, potentially, again, I'm not saying this has happened, but you could have potential office closures, okay? So what's the data point here? Number one, of these orphan practices or potentially vanishing practices, most of them aren't going to be DSO targets. So take that off the table to begin with. But you have a lot of the younger portions of the profession targeting joining the DSO movement, which I don't necessarily know is a great idea because some of the larger ones are already in a ton of debt. Associate retention is already bad. PE is pulling back, private equity. And but again, this presents that incredible opportunity. We're seeing clients do it. MGE clients are starting their own DSOs. But they're doing it as a doctor-driven DSO with the idea to revitalize private dentistry and bring these young people in and give them potential for ownership. We have a whole model for this that we're teaching our clients. And obviously you have to have your main practice in good shape and you have to know how to scale it and whatnot, which is what we teach people. It's very easy. But this can create a whole huge movement which actually revitalizes private dentistry, which is actually very cool. All right, so now, what about the labor outlook? What's the staff situation like? All right, so what is happening with the labor market? If you've been listening to the podcast for a while or just following this, you know that unemployment for a while was pretty tight. That remains relatively unchanged. This is U.S. unemployment. It's still in the 4% range. I have a 1-year and a 5-year graph. You'll see at the beginning of the graph, it's when we had the brief spike in unemployment due to COVID, okay? So now, job openings, though, this is an interesting statistic. If you remember this, I talked about it in a few episodes, or maybe you were following it. I don't know. At one point in the U.S., if you compare unemployment to job openings, there were 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed person, meaning the employment market was very tight, right? There were 2 jobs available for every 1 unemployed person. Well, that number is now closer to 1 to 1, right? And I have a graph for that too. So for every unemployed person, there's 1 job, okay? Now, I have this in my slides here, and I'm not going to go over this because I went over this 2 weeks ago in a separate podcast. We do have a hygienist shortage, and that does not look, it's almost, I don't know if it's as bad or worse than the dentist shortage. You've probably wondered, is it hard to find? Why is it so hard to find hygienists? Well, I explained that in that episode, and I have the slides here to back it up with the hygienist demographics and the number of hygienists being produced and the number coming out. So sort of the upshot with the employment market here is the labor market for non-technical staff, meaning administrative staff, has softened. It's much easier to find administrative staff than it was over the last few years, all right? General hiring should be easier. The labor market for hygienists is tight, and it will remain tight. And in that episode, I went over a few things that you could do to offset that or make sure that you retain the hygienists that you have. But it is tight, and it does not look like, whereas you have all these new dental programs opening up. And the data for hygiene is not as robust as it is for dentists. So it was hard for me to find this data out, but it does not look like we are producing enough hygienists to replace the number of hygienists that are either going part-time or exiting the market over the next 5+ years. So that is something that does need to be addressed. And there are ways around that. I did cover that in an episode about 2 weeks ago. All right. So now we get into cost, profitability, and fees and network participation. So obviously, I've talked about inflation over the last few years in the podcast, but from 2020 to 2024, inflation was pretty bad. It was 22.3% overall. Now, those are the government numbers, so most people look at that and go, that's low. I tend to agree with you. There's all kind of TikToks and videos of people going to Walmart in 2019, buying the same stuff in 2024, and it's 3 times as much. But the official numbers from 2020 to 2024 from April to April were 22.3%. So if something cost you $1 in 2020, April of 2020, it cost you $1.23 or 22 in April of 2024. The number the last year has only been 2.41%. So again, it's still inflation, but it's not as bad as it was before. That said, costs are still higher. Just because inflation is better doesn't mean costs are going down. I mean, they have in certain areas, but costs are still higher than they were 4 or 5 years ago. Which brings us to fees. And I've talked about this on various episodes, and for some reason it gains very little traction. Most folks don't adjust their fees regularly. If you've not adjusted your fees in the last 4 or 5 years, you're going to get yourself in trouble because all your other costs have gone up. That fees right now you should be staying on top of. You should be at least 20 to 25% where you were on your base fees, 5 years ago, at least. The problem is a lot of doctors are in network, especially in the United States, and you might be heavily in network. 70, 80% of your practice is in network. And that becomes a problem because sure, you can adjust your fees, but if you're 80% in network and you adjust your fees, you're really only adjusting them for 20% of your patients. You're not adjusting them for the other 80% because that's based upon whatever the insurance company is willing to pay to a network provider. So, our take on this is remaining in network at this point going forward is extremely dangerous, and you need to work your way out. What I'll do, I'll put a link on the episode webpage. We have something called the fees and plans analysis, which is we'll walk you through what's going on in your practice and how to get out of network, which at this point, to me, it isn't just something that's nice to do. It's something that you have to do over the next few years. And sometimes this takes a while. Some plans take a while to get out of. If you have a lot of network proliferation, there you go, in your practice, you're going to want to start working on it now because it may take a while to wrap it all up. But the basic data points here are inflation has gone up, obviously. It's gotten better the last year, but it's still there. It hasn't really gone down. Overall, prices aren't dropping everywhere. Remaining in low fee or in network can potentially destroy your ability to compete and maintain your team, not to mention profitability. So to ensure your success, you have to have the ability to affect your fees as you choose, which means you need to not be in network. And I recommend that fees and plans analysis. We have a couple of very unique strategies to get out. And keep in mind, DSOs, and again, I'm not slamming DSOs, but they're facing the same problems. Maybe they can negotiate better fees, but they're still accepting reduced fees. A lot of these are in network. So they have that going on too. So that's sort of the overall scene, right? So what's the big picture? Let me hit the key data points here and I'll wrap this up. First data point is the supply of dentists is projected to fall to 188,000 by 2028 with a slow recovery to a little under 200,000 by 2033. 20 to 30,000 practices are expected to disappear over the next 5 to 10 years because there's no succession plan in place, which is a combination of exiting older doctors and declining ownership from younger dentists. Over 1/3 of fourth-year dental students plan to work for a DSO upon graduation. A lot of these folks are driven largely by student debt and guaranteed income. Some of the major DSOs are in large amounts of debt. I demonstrated 3 of them here in this podcast. Associate turnover in DSOs could be higher than in private practice, at least based on that survey, which destabilizes operations. The general labor market has eased for non-licensed roles, but things like hygienists still remain critically low. You may also going forward, because we'll have less dentists, there may be more competition for associate doctors in that sense. Okay? So despite the fact that since 2020, inflation is up nearly 25%, insurance reimbursements have stagnated or in some cases declined. Okay. Now it's interesting, and I have a quote in this presentation here. It's in the slideshow, but it's actually from Dr. Winteregg. Greg and I started looking into all of this back in 2013. Greg came from the angle on the age demographics. I came from the angle on practice ownership and overall economic side, and we kind of met in the middle. And he said something at the time, which I wrote down, but it's dentistry is moving towards becoming a profession of haves and have-nots. And we're seeing this actually manifest. This was over 10 years ago. He said this. It was 13. And we're seeing it because you have some doctors that are just killing it. They're getting out of network. They have a private practice. It's very patient-centric, and they're having a great time. And you see other doctors that are trying to make a go of it on a $700 crown because that's all they can get from the insurance company. You see? So where is this all headed? Well, as more dentists retire and fewer practices and dentists remain, patients will be forced to consolidate into fewer locations based on just these vanishing locations. If you're positioned well, your practice, just by that fact alone, could get busier. Many of these retiring doctors' practices would not be model DSO targets. However, many of these would be excellent acquisition targets. This is what we're telling our clients for private doctors who have an entrepreneurial mind and want to build their own patient-centric DSO. These doctors who are retiring, you would buy a practice, you put a new associate in there, eventually you give that associate some partnership. It's a route to ownership for some of these younger doctors who aren't taking that route. This is how you could kind of help salvage, because sort of the way I presented this to our clients is somebody has to take responsibility for the dental industry the way it's currently being practiced, so it doesn't look like this cold corporate thing 5 or 10 years from now with no availability. So I put that call out to more than MGE clients. You could do it too. There's no reason we can't all take responsibility for the profession. Due to supply issues, hiring associate doctors, as I mentioned, and hygienists could become increasingly competitive. Now, this may be a non-issue based on if DSOs do expand or don't expand based on their financial situations. And again, I don't have privy to their numbers. I just gave you the publicly available information, and do with it what you will. So to win long-term, you want to make your practice a great environment, a place people want to work and stay. All right. And with rising wages, inflation, and stagnant PPO reimbursements, staying in network has become financially unsustainable. All right. And stable long-term growth is severely challenged by your inability to control your fee. And one thing I wouldn't be shocked, and I put a slide in here for this, is if you see these practices start to vanish and not enough doctors are buying them up, and DSOs don't buy them, you may end up with these kind of hybrid public-private options where the government in some rural area where there's just no dentist puts a government dental office there, which I'm sure will be the pinnacle of customer service. Anyway, but you get my point. It's not going to be built on quality, it'll be built on scarcity at that point. So what are we recommending to MGE clients? And I'm just going to tell you this because then you can do with it what you will. First thing is get out of network now. Control your revenue, your margins, and your ability to reinvest. All right. That's the first thing. Now you might listen to this and go, Jeff, I'm 80% PPO. How am I going to get out of network? Well, that's why I say try the fees and plans analysis. We have very unique approaches to this. We've helped tons of our clients get out of network. It's not as hard as you think it is. Okay. And then focus on growth. Use that extra margin you get by getting out of network to offer competitive pay and compensation to your team, fund practice expansion, keep your facilities and tech up to date, support training, mentorship, and team development, increase profitability and reduce cost, and unstress yourself by not being controlled by insurance companies. That's the first thing. Second thing, and this may sound, like a no-brainer, but I want you to really think about this for a second. Build your staff for growth. Whether you're expanding into a large single practice, because there are going to be more patients for less dentists, so be prepared for growth. Or you're looking at multiple locations, you need great people. Okay? Focus on expansion. You need to, I told the clients this, is a lot of our clients get really good. They're already good dentists, but then they get really good at sales, or they get really good at being an executive. I told them they need to focus on having that same level of professionalism on hiring an HR, making sure they have an incredibly tight HR and hiring and onboarding line. And they create a culture that attracts long-term team members. That's what you got to do. You want to make a place that people want to continue to work and want to be. Okay. Because great people reduce stress, support growth. And the cool thing about great people is those become your eventual executives. I can't tell you how many office managers I've seen that started as the lead dental assistant. Or a doctor brings their office manager prospect and it's their lead dental assistant or their hygienist or their front desk person. They weren't the office manager to begin with. You see, your practice must become a place where top talent thrives. And especially if you're not going to be a network, top talent is what keeps a 5-star customer service level and makes it easier to maintain. The other thing too is if I've got 5 great team members and I lose one, it's a lot easier to inject a new team member into that situation because I have 4 other people to make sure that they can bring this other person up to standard. If I only have 1, that becomes tougher. Now, if you want to expand beyond this, if you're inclined, add locations. Make them doctor-led and focused on quality care. You want to do it the right way, not fueled by debt. And the idea is to mirror your practice's quality and culture in these additional locations because you're going to have this huge opportunity over the next 5 to 10 years. As I mentioned, 20 to 30,000 practices are projected to vanish. Well, why shouldn't you buy them and turn them into satellites of your office? I mean, ideally, if your office is in one, you have an office in a city and another in a suburb, I should feel like I'm in the same practice. Maybe the physical location is different and the staff are different, but there's a uniform level of high quality customer care in both. There's no reason not to have that. And it also, what I love about it is you take these younger docs who instead of going and working for a DSO, they come work for you. And they're in a mentorship type situation with potential partnership opportunities. So then you're sort of passing the torch to these younger folks and showing them what private dentistry should be. And you can continue to expand to satellite locations. A properly run satellite location should have a 20% net. Without you, it doesn't mean you won't work there. But the main thing I tell our clients is if you're going to have a satellite location, it should not survive because you work there. If you want to go there and do implants once in a while, hey man, great. But it should not be required for you to work there. The place should net 20% without you having to go there. You should go there to make sure quality is maintained, but it should not require you to meet its production levels. And one thing, I'll throw this out to you. You may or may not be interested in something like this. We're actually later in the year in November, we're having something we call the DSO Summit. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage where you can email if you're interested. It's actually going to be me and Sabri. You've heard Sabri on other episodes where we walk you through the whole process on how to acquire additional locations and build the infrastructure for a doctor-led, patient-centric DSO that is not in network. If you're interested, I'll have the promotion for it here. It's on November 11th through 15th. It's 5 days here at the MGE Florida office, and we'll also put a link to it on the episode webpage. And the last thing I would do, and this was the challenge, as I mentioned, that I gave our clients, is we need to take responsibility for dentistry. So we need to change the system. So what would I recommend? You're a doctor, you're in private practice. Get involved locally or on a state level with your dental society or your state legislators. Now, why? If you can easily, it's tough, we all get focused on national politics. And again, we're apolitical and a religious organization, right? We're here about, our MGE is about increasing or improving conditions in your dental practice. But, there is no but. That is where we're at. But, I said but again. The point being I'm making is everybody's focused on national politics. So, my congressperson, my senator. The people who are the movers and shakers in your state, in the United States, are your state legislators. These are the ones who approve programs for state colleges and things like this. And it's very easy to talk to these folks, your state rep or your state senator. Make your state rep and senator aware. If you don't have a dental school in your area or dental schools need increased capacity, make them aware of this, especially if you're in a state that has an underserved population from a healthcare perspective. This is something that they could get into and get behind. As far as political messaging, this is so non-polarizing. We need the ability to have more doctors. Who's not going to agree with that, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum? You see. So I would make them aware of 3 things. 1, we need expanded dental school capacity. 2, we need more hygiene school capacity because that is abysmally low across the United States. And 3, if there was some way, maybe we could affect overall tuition costs for dental school because they are crippling to a lot of people. And that's one of the main reasons. I did an episode on this a while back on stress and burnout. One of the biggest sources of stress for younger doctors is student debt because they're walking out with a lot of it. If they had less debt, which they used to, they might be more inclined to buy an office, and that might actually salvage this private practice issue that we're having for younger doctors. The other thing you could do too is go to the school you went to that you're an alumni of or your local dental school and talk to seniors and promote the idea of private practice. Why not? Because if anything, if you need an associate one day, one of these folks might want to come work for you, or at least they'll go start their own office. They'll at least have that seed planted in their head, because I'll tell you who is going to the dental schools. DSOs are going to dental schools and recruiting very heavily. Private doctors just saying, hey, you should have your own office. They're not going to dental schools, and you should. If you can support residency programs in your state, we have some clients that are actually acting as a place where residents can come and work a little bit and then gain some experience. And the other last point I'd make, and I brought this up to our clients as well, is I've heard, this is again anecdotal, and I can't really speak to this point because I'm not a dentist, but I've heard from some of our clients when they get doctors who are newer graduates, their clinical skill or speed or courage, what they're willing to do and not do, which has to do with certainty really, is not where it used to be. So someone who graduated in 95 versus someone who graduates in 2025, they're not the same, in other words, is what they're saying, or even somebody who graduated in 05. So if you feel that's a problem, like there's a problem with dental school curriculums, talk to your dental school, talk to your state society, your local society. And you can, maybe we need to modernize these curriculums a bit. I mean, for instance, an implant is sort of, as an example, let's just talk about this for a second. An implant is considered standard of care for replacing a missing tooth now. It is no longer a bridge. 20, 30 years ago it was a bridge, right? But kids don't graduate from school knowing how to place an implant. Isn't that kind of silly when you think about it? When that's considered, they have to take additional CE courses to learn how to place an implant, but that's considered what you're supposed to do. Shouldn't that be part of dental school? Anyway, that's my point. So the point being is not only take responsibility for yourself, your team, your family, expand it out to the profession. Because if enough people did this, we could actually salvage private dentistry. And the reason I brought all that DSO stuff up is I don't know that currently the way DSOs are positioned, that they are the future of the profession, because it looks like the gas is at least, the pedal's not as pushed down as hard anymore. It's not as, the pedal isn't to the metal anymore like it was 4 or 5 years ago. So we're kind of in this funny spot, but we are in a spot where we're going to be losing offices over the next few years unless some people take action. And if enough of us all put our shoulder to the wheel and took responsibility, the profession could look the way that we want, which is patient-focused, quality-focused over the next 5-10 years, rather than turning into, who knows what, as a result of the current forces that are at work. And again, in the process, as you're doing this, you can do incredibly well. Anyway, no longer episode. I have those links on the episode webpage to the slideshow where I have all my statistics in there and whatnot. I also have the link to the fees and plans analysis. If you want to check that out, I would definitely recommend you do it because you need to get out of plans if you're in them. Folks, I do hope that helped. As I mentioned, longer episode, but it's important to know what's going on in your profession. If you have any questions, you can always email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com, and you can find out more about us at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, have a great week, and we will see you at the next episode.